on folk culture and the extended universe, a letter concerning the development of distant art with included prototype. In 2021, the platitude "get woke, go broke" is dead. Everyone got woke, and no one who got woke went broke. The meme was on life support before 2019. In 2021, its corpse is starting to smell. Did anyone ever believe this? Probably not, and from this point onward we should be honest about our situation. There would be more dignity. In present year, there isn't a single intellectual property not going in the progressive direction, slowly but surely conforming its theme to the sensibilities of gay pride and Black Lives Matter. What's next? Intersectional Shakespeare? Female Space Marines in Warhammer 40k? An even more woke version of Star Wars? Maybe this time they could take a stand and make the protagonist a transgender, demi-queer Wookiee. Would that be enough to break ground? The pattern is always the same. While broad, the arc of our moral universe always bends towards Steven universe, from space opera to race opera. It is true that in current year we can't have nice things. Nice things are just too dangerous for our increasingly paranoid ruling class. Culture, even pop culture, is a weapon in the hands of its enemies. To paraphrase the original Big Joe, if ideas are more powerful than guns, and imagination is more powerful than ideas, why would a government which regulates guns allow their citizens to have unregulated imaginations? The logic is pretty airtight, and looking forward into 2022, we really shouldn't expect anything different. What? Are progressives going to suddenly stop believing they are on the right side of history? Are they suddenly going to get peevish about using state power? Don't everyone hold your breath at once here. Indeed, dear reader, it is getting stuffy in here. It's not just you, it's not just me, and it's not just the fact we've been locked down for more than a year. The claustrophobia is creeping into our lives at a much deeper level, and it begins behind our own eyes. There is a narrowing of our horizons, a throttling of the number of futures we are even capable of thinking possible, a closing of the Western imagination. More and more these days, I've come to believe that the most lamentable thing about living in a declining civilization is the utter lack of imagination. I'm not just talking about politics here. The slow ruin of cultural innovation is real, and has been working its slow poison on our society for decades, moving, as always, from the top of things down to the very bottom. It was first noticeable decades ago when the trickle of good modern art and music virtually ceased. Now, 30 years later, it's not only impossible to find a watchable Oscar-nominated movie, it's nearly impossible to find any reliable avenue to just turn your brain off and enjoy some stupid science fiction that isn't infested by banal political tripe and the unmistakable whiff of elite self-flattery. Forget wanting to win the culture war, most people just want some respite. And is there no end to this ride? Is there no returning to the way things used to be? What was said once long ago bears repeating. We can't keep living like this. A question I hear commonly from watchers of my vlog is how we can find, or perhaps even create, things that are good instead of fundamentally corrupt society. When people say this, they don't necessarily mean beautiful or spiritual things, just good things, wholesome things, lasting things, or maybe just fun things. We always have to be careful of nostalgia, but it seems most people these days can't help but remember better times every time they look at the absolute state of culture in 2021. I remember in 2014 using the phrase, "You couldn't make something like that these days," in reference to un-PC films like Blazing Saddles or un-PC books like Fight Club. In 2021, the phrase, "You couldn't make something like that these days," applies to almost all past culture of note. So can we have nice things anymore? No one seems to be making them. Many people speculate that in the future we will only have the nice things that we can create. But to date, most attempts to break free from our present culture and go in an autonomous direction fall flat on their faces. And even when these projects don't fail, they tend to underdeliver. At this stage, I can tell that people are asking themselves whether independent cultural creation is even possible. How could an autonomous and healthy cultural space make a return in late modernity? And I think this question needs a much better answer than I've heard to date. My last Substack letter was criticized for being overly negative and focusing solely on critique, trailing off into airy-fairy platitudes about something larger, never specified. In this letter, I intend to fully break with this pattern and deliver a message that is 100% solution-oriented. Beginning with the problem of creating independent, distant media in broad allegorical strokes, I will end the letter with a myopically focused, crackpot solution, which, if followed, could offer a proof-of-concept way to effectively organize a collective art project for interested non-progressives. In all likelihood, this letter is probably going to be a complete mess, so it's probably fair to provide some signposting for people who want to skip around. The letter, as published on Substack, will consist of 5 parts. Part 1 describes the problem of common culture and modernity in broad strokes. Part 2 outlines a common dissident solution and its attendant problems. Part 3 explores the nature of folk culture and how such a concept could patch problems with collective undertakings in the future. Part 4 outlines a general approach to these solutions, with Part 5 giving a specific and detailed outline of a hypothetical implementation of this approach that is well within the reach of someone like myself. Once more, I expect a certain divergence in tone in each section, so be advised, read what you want, stop when you want, and hopefully you'll find at least one part of this letter interesting and useful for your own projects. Part 1. The Ruin of Our Cultural Ecosystem. The right has a creativity problem. At this stage, even mentioning this cliché is so tired that I feel dirty writing it. But cliché or not, this is our starting point, and so we have to repeat the familiar line of questions that everyone has probably already asked themselves. If culture is woke, and woke culture sucks, then why don't the non-woke just build their own culture? How hard could it be? All of these popular corporate intellectual properties started somewhere, didn't they? To date, while building a new culture has been the hope of right-wingers since the 1980s, nothing like a right-wing cultural renaissance has come to pass. Why is this? There are predictably many explanations, depending on what side of the political spectrum you ask. If you ask a lefty, this absence of right-wing culture is due to an inherent lack of creativity, endemic to the diseased nature of the right-wing mind. If you ask a righty, the problem usually comes down to lack of institutional support. However, for my own money, these cute explanations miss the point. The problem is much larger. We are dealing with an issue of a decline in our cultural ecosystem. It is less a problem of who we are, and more of a problem of where we are as a society. It is less an issue of left-wing versus right-wing, more a problem of the social environment in the early 21st century. The real problem, a la Mark Fisher, is not right-wing non-creativity, but rather a lack of creativity in the West writ large. People have noticed this on the right first, because the right is the weaker party, the party with less institutional support. But the issue of cultural decline is society-wide. In some sense, the left is not so much immune from this creative decline, but oblivious to it. They see their side winning with more corporate media outlets repeating their slogans. But is this growth due to the emergence of a radical new progressive imagination, like people dreamed of in the 1960s? Or is it just institutional creep? In 2021, any progressive might be forgiven for asking where all the new leftist visionaries are hiding. If this revolutionary age of left-wing ascendancy is really a new 1968-style cultural revolution, where can we find the great poets of our time? Who are the Beatles of 2021? The Bob Dylans? Heck, I would even accept a modern-day Barbara Streisand in a pinch. But wish as any lefty might, there are no great 21st century progressive luminaries, no great 21st century progressive artists, and no memorable 21st century progressive authors. In the grim bleakness of the early 21st century progressive mind, there is only conquest, and never creativity. And I imagine this must be a little disconcerting for any earnest progressive, at least if he thinks about it. Opening the paper, scrolling through Netflix, or even watching the Academy Awards, can a progressive easily come across a piece of culture that isn't repeating his own social worldview back to him in the most banal, lowest common denominator way? This mainstream ideological sycophancy might be fun at first, but it could quickly lose its charm and become inauthentic, if not outright creepy. All the culture is left, but is there any real culture left? In the age of social media and woke capital, creativity seems to have evaporated or fallen into a strange and predictable cycle of outrage, narcissism, and reaction. The issue isn't decline in demand for good art. It might not even be a decline in raw talent, although I suspect at some level this might be the case. The main problem lies in something deeper and harder to point to. The root of the issue is environmental and collective. It is not so much a decline of the cultural specimen, but a decline in the cultural ecosystem. Okay, but analogies aside, what does this mean? We should start with the simple observation that good art and good cultural texts generally do not emerge from nothing. There is an environment that facilitates their growth. This is a bit counterintuitive for modern Westerners who have been trained for centuries to focus on the producer-consumer relationship. We like good art, we pay artists for their good art. At some point in this process, we start receiving bad art. What's the problem? The range of correctable issues seems pretty limited. Did the artist become untalented suddenly? Did we ask for the wrong product? Maybe the issue is further down the supply chain. Did the artist miss their shipments of precious imported Japanese brushes or super special Mongolian paint? Once we think about the problem this way, it's hard to think in a different direction. But perhaps the core issue at hand might become clearer if we varied the example to the realm of agriculture. Every weekend, I, City Slicker Dave, bike down to my local farmer's market. I buy a box of premium heirloom tomatoes from my favorite farmer, Farmer John, consume those tomatoes, and am thoroughly satisfied with their superlative quality. For 30 years this pattern persists, and then one day, Farmer John shows up to the market empty-handed. Almost no tomatoes this season, and the ones that made it to market are sickly and sour. What happened? The weather hasn't changed, so that couldn't be the issue. Did Farmer John suddenly forget how to farm? Did he lose his seed stock? Did the gods decide to smite him for his impiety? Actually, the problem we are facing here is literally deeper. 30 years ago, Farmer John inherited his farm from his father, who grew Siberian pea trees. Looking to do better financially, John plowed the field under and replanted his famous, highly profitable heirloom tomatoes. Everything went well on the surface, but now, after 30 years of a monoculture, the soil is completely depleted. Nothing grows, least of all his famous heirloom tomatoes. Time for a crop rotation? I suppose, but the land's ecology has gotten so bad, even the old pea plants won't take root. The whole field has reverted to wilds, packed with shrubs, and whatever sickly tomato plants still exist on the vanishingly small amount of fertile soil. And a kind of analogous cultural ecological collapse might be what we are seeing in 2021. Just like plant life, art does not simply emerge from the ground ex nihilo. It relies on a substance of common heritage and history, a folkway, as people used to say. At base, this is nothing special. We are simply talking about the common memes and cultural literacy that define a particular time and place and connect it to its common past and future. This is the circulatory system that transports concepts of meaning to the core tropes people use to populate their imaginations. Creative types, be they genius or hack, are fundamentally participating in a dialectic with this substrate, recombining, restating, critiquing, taking steps, or sometimes even leaps forward. The process of artistic creation may appear to be entirely individualistic, but there is an essential collective component here. As even the egomaniacal Richard Wagner understood, an artist requires a folk to be his audience. Artists are in a larger conversation with a culture, but they also have an audience with cultural assumptions. And to really have an impact, a creator requires patrons with access to some cultural, symbolic language, hence folkways, and hence folk culture. In a way, we might understand these rather abstract notions as a type of invisible hand that aligns the interests of the cultural creators and consumers just as the market aligns the interests of producers and buyers. Remove the invisible hand, and there is an information asymmetry that prevents anything from getting accomplished. Does this idea sound crackpot? Perhaps, but I think we can witness this concept at work, even in our own consumption preferences. For instance, just look at the things you think are cool. In all likelihood, if you think hard, disembodying yourself from your own culture, you will realize that, in addition to being cool, they're also pretty stupid. And just so you don't think I'm picking on you, let's examine 3 stupid things that I think are cool. ordered from most boomer to most bugman. 1. Bob Dylan. 2. The Siege of Minas Tirith from Lord of the Rings. 3. The Space Marines from the Warhammer 40k universe. Every one of these things is cool, and every one of these things is also pretty stupid. Why don't I see Bob Dylan as simply a frumpy folk singer with a frog voice who just happens to write better than average song lyrics? Why don't I see the orcish Siege of Minas Tirith as a silly monster fight just as goofy as any B-movie gimmick? Why do I not see Warhammer Space Marines as He-Man clones in steel underpants fighting battles that make no physical sense, even to people who don't understand physics? Well, in all of these cases, it's because these things fit into a folk pattern, or as they say these days, into a trope, that allows them to be more than their forms. They contain something ancient, something that might point to deeper meaning, and something that might point to deeper beauty. Behind the image of Bob Dylan lies the ancient trope of the troubadour, the wandering poet who finds capital T truth just by being present and honestly observing his times. Behind the image of the orcs at Minas Tirith is the dark image of the wild man, Shakespeare's Caliban, the skulking Grendel of Beowulf, and the eternal battle between civilization and chaotic barbarism. When we see a space marine, no one actually sees a space marine. What the hell could space marine even mean? Instead, what we see is the trope of the knight, the paladin, and the warrior priest who brings order into the wilderness, sometimes conquering it, and sometimes being conquered by it. This process of integrating specific culture into a folk tradition isn't necessarily conscious. In fact, most of the time it absolutely isn't. But nevertheless, we are making these connections inside a collective context. And these things that we love would be meaningless without the historical folkways in play. That is what gives them their gravity, their emotional resonance, and their staying power. Of course, none of these observations are new. Not even on YouTube. In fact, I've had them repeated back to me many times by the YouTube autoplay algorithm's darling, Dr. Jordan Peterson. From Peterson, you can hear all about the common Jungian collective subconsciousness and its role in pop culture and traditional culture. In other talks, also by Peterson, you can hear many lamentations about the present state of our politics and cultural space, the danger of creeping censorship, the lack of imagination and drive, people preferring indulgence to self-improvement. But throughout all of this, I've often wondered why the good doctor doesn't integrate these two concepts in a way more focused on the collective nature of the problem. Might we imagine that the problems that pervade our post-liberal, post-woke world owe in part to the erosion of a common collective archetypical consciousness? For all the hours of Peterson content autoplayed into my ears, I have never heard the doctor focus on this particular way of conceptualizing the problem. And that's a shame, because it seems to be the perfect framework we need to understand where our culture is actually going. From where I'm sitting right now, our society's decline is impossible to understand outside of a view of some collective cultural ecosystem, some common folkway or collective spiritual consciousness that once inhabited the West. And looking at our situation from this perspective, we see that the circumstances are quite grim. Not only have the old regional ethnic traditions of kith and kin long since been vaporized by the early 20th century nationalist and socialist projects, by the early 21st century, the core cultural substrate of religion and broad ethnic identity is waning before our very eyes. Witness the rise of the nuns, the post-national man, and the citizen of the world, who always seems more like a citizen of nowhere. Welcome to a world where most people have no contact with any identity even remotely connected to something their parents or grandparents would understand. Welcome to Planet Bugman. And in the place of deep, common, collective culture, what remains? Mass market pop culture, consumer identities, and fandoms. And even in these completely shallow communities, things are falling apart. Whereas once even consumer identities were at least somewhat connected to a core set of cultural experiences, this loose connection is fading. Likewise, the remaining cultural elements with some innocence or gravity still present in our modern entertainment products are being stripped away, and a barren desert of naked corporate cynicism expands before us. In the final stage, our mass popular culture is descending to the lowest common denominator trash equipped with hollow narcissistic themes, unnatural fanfic tier writing, and banal, on-the-nose political messaging, incapable of reflecting any lasting themes that will survive the next political realignment. Everything is owned, all the area for expansion is staked out, and nothing good, true, or beautiful is being produced. Is this analysis still too abstract? The thing is, even if I turn away from my broader suspicions, I come to a similar conclusion about the state of popular culture every time I think deeply about why some common genre, so popular and effective at communicating meaning in my youth, now seems hollow in my maturity. For instance, I imagine it's not impossible to make good TV sitcoms, like The Simpsons or The Cosby Show. We still have a fair amount of intelligent and talented people in Hollywood, and no one ever gets tired of making money on successful shows. But the concept of a family sitcom doesn't really make sense in the present year. The core essence of a sitcom is a lighthearted ribbing of the assumed default of middle American normalcy. The core form of the sitcom is the introduction of an overblown problem that inevitably gets resolved back to the status quo by the end of the episode, mirroring the 20th century middle class's perception of itself as silly, but ultimately indestructible. By the early 21st century, both the form and essence of this product are missing. The middle American nuclear family is no longer the default reality in most of America, and its survival into the future is very much not assured. In fact, with the later sitcoms of the early 2000s, the prime target of satire seems more the sitcoms of previous decades, rather than any existing family structure modern people would consider normal. Additionally, I know for a fact there is a great thirst for a science fiction space opera that young men can consume unironically, just as their parents resonated unironically seeing Luke Skywalker fight Darth Vader. Unfortunately, the artists of our age don't believe in unironic adventure. It turns out that there isn't much left of the hero of 1,000 faces once you strip away all of the faces of patriarchy. Present science fiction writers can create woke heroes and celebrate their girl bosses, and the peanut gallery can continue to hurl their regressive fuck yous back at them. But in the process, there is no depth. There is nothing really to believe in. Even the artist who creates the new improved progressive remake doesn't really seem to believe in it. And finally, for those fans of folk culture out there, while I do believe there is a great work of rural poetry or music waiting to be written about the decline of rural America in 2021, it's impossible to imagine the artists or the audience for this text. Unlike the 1930s, music, let alone poetry, is no longer the language of our plebeian heartland. Furthermore, I don't think our modern musical elites, either in Nashville or in New York, are chomping at the bit to produce a new tune taking aim at the demon fentanyl and the devil Pornhub, just as their Depression-era predecessors described the vices of whiskey and bootlegging. Perhaps this is a little anecdotal, but the common pattern remains. There are interesting things to be said, but no one wants to say them. There are interesting messages to proclaim, but no one wants to hear them. The artist and the folk are tuned into different radio frequencies, and the only communication which remains is an endless stream of shrill vanity on one end and simmering silent contempt on the other. Again, the problem isn't on any one side of the equation, but in the decline of the medium that once connected them. But for us dissidents, these cultural problems always seem like an opportunity. After all, we say that the key to moving forward is building things. We think we have a more realistic and more truthful perception of the world as it is. Perhaps we could start with the truth and then move it slowly towards an expression in art and culture. A lot of people want this. I want this. But to date, so far, there has been a notable lack of progress. Whatever desire for dissident art exists in the early 21st century, it hasn't produced much. Some of this is, of course, forgivable. We are talking about dissidents after all. There is fleeting organization, no funding, and little support. It's not really fair to ask for something big. No one is expecting the nationalist version of V for Vendetta, or the NRX version of Toy Story, or a Landian version of Game of Thrones. Still, some amount of underachievement needs to be owned and solved. We all want a certain type of deep culture, a certain foundation on which we can express ideas and a poetic understanding of the universe. Yet this is not forthcoming. I'm not saying people don't produce things. I'm not saying dissidents don't make content. We all make content. We have our music, our webcomics, our role-playing games, our blogs, and our vlogs. But at the same time, this hasn't metastasized. I know many people who write novels and build brilliant fantasy worlds. Some of them are quite good. If the Franklin is listening to this, I have a 20 spot waiting for you when The Words of Enzi finally comes out in print. Yet even inside dissident circles, some key infrastructure is missing. Community is missing. For instance, I can't remember ever finishing a distant cultural project and then going out to discuss the characters and themes with other fans, as would be typical with other more mainstream cultural work. Even for smaller franchises and cult phenomena, this is weird. In the earliest days of the internet, when everything was fringe, people would talk endlessly about the stupidest webcomics and in-jokes. Why has this suddenly changed? A critical part of the equation is missing, specifically the collective side of the equation. True community is absent. The community we have is currently driven by political gripes, and everything is disconnected. If I were to put this in a more solution-oriented way, the subculture lacks a certain critical mass or critical energy. Stories get written, less frequently read, even less frequently discussed, and almost never iterated on. And without this iterative and reflective dynamic, which we used to expect from our culture, there's no opportunity for any given text to grow into a larger reservoir of symbols and shared language. And I know, it's still early days. The post-left/dissident right hasn't even really felt out what it is. But for everyone who's been doing this for a while, we really need to be focused on what the next logical step is in the process. If the only nice things are the things we can build, what, we might ask, would be worthwhile to attempt to build? What even can be achieved with the tools that we actually have before us? And how can what we build burgeon into a larger community of creativity and imagination? Part 2. The Shared Extended Universe and its Discontents. I'm sure from this point we could take many tracks, but for this letter, I want to focus on a persistent desire, deeply felt by many in my own generation, the desire for a fantasy or science fiction universe insulated from political wokeness and able to explore new ideas independent of mainstream cultural pieties. And odds are, if you're like me, or if you belong to a generation older than Generation X, you understand this desire. In fact, there probably is some fictional world that possesses your imagination. I myself was lucky enough to miss the Star Wars and Star Trek crazes, but the Tolkien and Warhammer bugs bit me hard. Derivative or not, it doesn't take much for me to pick up a book or a game that takes place in one of these universes, even if I know it is, by any objective standard, bad. I'm that bastard from college who convinced you to read Children of Hurin until you realized that it was basically Beowulf with elves and Balrogs. No apologies here, man. Children of Hurin is good, even if it is, well, bad. The goodness of the initial text sometimes isn't even the important thing. The goodness of the universe can be enough. One feels a gravitational draw towards it. One is in love with its mythology, its shine, its lurking emotions never quite expressed. Yet at the same time, these fantasy and science fiction universes are the bane of dissidents. All of them have their origin in some text that is thoroughly reactionary. Almost all are now corporate intellectual properties, kept alive by the effort of an older and more dedicated fan base. All are now ruled by a myopic corporate and activist class that care more about political messaging and profit than the coherency of the product itself. The result is not hard to predict: an intellectual property slowly moving away from its core utility, still kept in its place of prominence for as long as its inertia lasts. But for dissidents, what's most ironic is that the creation of any specific extended universe remains something less than a staggering achievement. In fact, creating a new extended universe is quite easy. A brief survey of popular IPs demonstrates the proposition. Certainly things like Dune and Lord of the Rings are the products of outstanding genius, but these are exceptions. For the most part, popular franchises like Star Wars, Warhammer, or Dungeons & Dragons are entirely derivative remixes of older material, iterated forward by corporate focus groups. In fact, this process of extended universe building is so straightforward that it is literally sold as an entertainment product itself. A whole range of role-playing games exist to walk the average buyer through the process of creation step by step, and worlds produced by this process have even been recycled back into the system to produce new corporate IP. Given these circumstances, a creation of this sort can't be that hard to do, and yet the media landscape always looks the same. A few big players dominate our imaginative space, every one of them managing an older universe which they didn't create and are slowly driving into the ground. At this stage, everyone reading this is likely thinking of a solution, probably the same solution. A solution I heard most recently from my friend and fellow YouTuber Morgoth on a shared podcast. Briefly stated, given that everyone on the right wing is looking for some common environment, why not build our own shared extended science fiction or fantasy universe? The extended universe might be totally original, but it wouldn't need to be. It would just need to be a place where distant ideas could be explored fully, in communication with the human truths that we can all see so readily. It would just need to be a fantasy realm of our own. Again, this isn't rocket science. We are simply proposing what 1,000 other companies, big and small, have already accomplished with a minimal amount of investment and inspiration. Just like Warhammer, just like Dragonlance, or even just like Homestuck. Not much is even required. A common canon, a set amount of rules that govern the universe, and then an infinite sea of possibilities for the creation of short stories, art, games, and shared memes that can develop an imagination completely separate of what woke entertainment capital wants. And I admit, on the surface, this is a good idea. It does strike me as achievable. People can realistically imagine something like this happening, and people can realistically imagine something like this working and even being great. I suppose this is why the proposition is so frequently suggested, and greeted with so much enthusiasm when suggested. But good idea or not, for whatever reason, people never seem to want to take the final step and pull the trigger. Why is this? In short, it's because while the idea is romantic, the implementation problems are decidedly unromantic. As such, while the problems are very solvable, discussing their implementation sort of ruins the fantasy of the endeavor, and therefore no one wants to address them. But if we are really interested in this kind of project, not just interested in dreaming about it, perhaps we could take the next step and confront the barriers. In fact, the problems aren't even that numerous. There is really only one big problem, one big, unromantic barrier to the success of this dream. At the risk of sounding coy, perhaps I can illustrate this big problem by just describing how conversations around the shared extended universe usually go. For example, following my recent discussion on this topic with Morgoth, I did receive a large number of communications looking to volunteer on a project to produce a new shared extended universe. People were enthusiastic. They wanted to take the next step. Pretty good so far. With so many volunteers, we should be on our way to starting something and breaking ground. But before we go further, let's take a look at those volunteering more closely. The offers to volunteer usually follow one of two distinct forms, which I will reproduce here with a little exaggeration for purposes of illustration. The first type of volunteer offer goes a little bit like this. Hey Dave, I really like your idea of a new shared science fiction universe. In fact, you might be surprised to know that I have been working on just such an extended universe in my own spare time. You will be happy to hear that I have an extensive outline of the world, including rules for how magic technology make it different from our own, and other details about the environment. This universe has a fully fleshed out factions and maps, a storied history, annotated in timeline form, not as a narrative of course. I have a variety of settings and locations worked out, descriptions of various races and nations, profiles of the people and legends that occupy and define the universe. Really, it's all ready to go. All I need at this stage is a group of creative authors and artists to flesh out the thing, and build fun content around the setting which I have designed. I need artists to create the art and write the stories, perhaps even a game developer to engineer a game system that can bring this fully realized universe from my notepad to a medium ready for consumption. When are you available to talk about these implementation details? The second type of volunteer offer goes like this. Hey Dave, I'm a skilled artist who can construct fully realized and realistic fantasy art, with a long work experience producing content for publications. I am also a writer capable of generating long, well-written prose with well-developed characters and suspenseful plots, well-described settings and memorable twists with poignant themes of deep human relevance. Furthermore, in my spare time, I developed well-balanced games, both digital and tabletop, with innovative and balanced game mechanics that keep players coming back for more. My one problem is that I just can't seem to think up an extended science fiction or fantasy setting to contain all of the content I am generating. I have a total inability to draw up outlines of factions, construct maps, recombine themes from past science fiction and fantasy universes to bring a new world into being. Do you know anyone who might be in the process of constructing such a universe that could tell me exactly what I can and can't write about, draw about, or design my game around? Again, the person I need to tell me what to draw and write doesn't have to be you, or any content creator who I actually already like. It can just be some random person who wants to outline a universe. Without this input, I'm really lost going forward. Could you offer me any suggestions? And indeed, you can see how these two types of volunteering offer are two sides of a single coin that could work together to form a shared fictional universe. Oh, wait, snap. I'm just checking my notes right now, and it turns out I have never gotten a message of the second type, just messages of the first type. There seems to be a slight asymmetry in demand for roles here. Like all collective projects, we have run into the classic problem of communism. Everyone is signing up to be an ideological commissar, no one is signing up to be a toiling proletariat. Too many people want to design the universe in broad strokes and control its outline at the top level. Too few people actually want to populate the details of this universe with their own focused effort, skill, and time. And before I get ahead of myself, I want to be clear for those who wrote me. I get it. In fact, I more than get it. I'm one of you. I too have my own outlines for science fiction and fantasy universes scrawled out on notebooks locked away in the back of my file cabinet. I too want to see my vision given life by skilled artists and storytellers. I want to be the one in control of a new shared universe. At the same time, do I really want to build every element of it? Do I want to write books, design games, create art? Do I even have the time to do all of these things? Well, not unless you pay me enough for this to be my full-time job, and I do already have a YouTube channel and a child to occupy my time as well. Again, I'm not trying to be rude, but I need to be blunt about the bottleneck here. I know people who are contacting me are highly skilled, creative people with detailed universes in tow. I know that most of you aren't untalented in other capacities. I know you probably have skills in writing. You may even be talented artists or game designers. And I know that managing a world, GMing as it's called in role-playing, is hard work. For sure, if you were managing, or GMing, an IP with an established market presence that millions of people loved, ensuring consistency, continuity, and clearness of theme and setting, the exact thing that modern IP owners aren't doing, this would be an enormous contribution. But in the context of a startup project with no pre-existing content, the situation is much more delicate. While GMing is an art of sorts, it is an art that only a very small number of people do well, and most of the people who think they do it well don't actually do it very well. We all have memories of bad role-playing sessions among friends. Everything is going well, and then some super silly element is introduced into the plot that just ruins the illusion. For the most part, we roll with this because we're friends with the GM and because we are playing a silly game. But while putting cringe plot elements into a created universe is very forgivable among friends playing a game, it is lethal to a project that ties together many disinterested parties who don't actually know each other. One silly name or goofy alien race introduced to an otherwise serious universe could cause a ripple effect of people leaving the project due to a creative conflict of visions. As it turns out, it is exponentially easier to ruin a shared project through mismanagement than it is to build up through the arduous creation of its core content. And people understand this dynamic, revealing it subconsciously with their preference to manage a shared universe rather than to contribute to someone else's. And if you are not convinced, we can test this proposition. If you are a creator who likes the idea of starting your own extended fantasy or science fiction universe, how willing would you be to spend a serious amount of time writing short stories in another person's extended universe? Not my extended universe, mind you, not some YouTuber who you like, just some anonymous internet user who provided you with a set of rules and tells you what you can and cannot include inside your own stories. Now, for those of you who haven't written fiction, keep in mind that these creative writing projects usually take about 1 to 2 weeks of free time if you have a job and a family, unless you're a much faster writer than I am. And remember also, when you submit your story, the GM can always nix it because the story doesn't fit into the thematic feel of the universe. Did I mention that you don't actually know this person or have any experience with this universe beyond a design document? You're not a fan who loves an existing game or movie or story, you're just volunteering. Volunteering, in essence, to have a boss for your own creative expression. Let's just say that I'm not surprised that there aren't a lot of takers for this proposition. Certainly, some solutions to this problem naturally propose themselves. Everyone has their own universe, so why not merge the universes together? Why not have a giant group Zoom call with everyone interested and then make compromises until all the different visions can fit into one pot and then go forward with that shared vision? That's the democratic way, and it's the way to instant success. Of course, no one who understands anything about real politics or human social organization could ever think that this would work well. The result of this process, the process of merging many creative universes together, has only 2 possible outcomes. Neither are good. Under the first possible outcome of some collective design, the number of designers making significant inputs remains large, which means, in essence, that we have transformed our extended science fiction universe into a committee project, defined by what many people want and can vie for politically. Knowing how these things go, after concordance is reached, the document describing the project will likely be novella-sized, filled with an enormous amount of rules, some contradictory, and will probably not be fully conceptualized by any of the people who put the document together to begin with. If you thought adopting someone else's universe was like volunteering to have a boss, how about volunteering to have 20 bosses? As they say, out of the frying pan and into the fire. The second possible outcome of a collective design for an extended universe is the exact opposite of the first. Instead of many creators making significant inputs, there is a gradual narrowing of the scope until only 1 or 2 people are actually in charge of describing the project, and most other volunteers either leave or fall silent. Of course, in this scenario, we are pretty much right back to where we started, with one central GM of the extended universe. So what was the point in collaboration to begin with? The 1 or 2 last men standing could have just collaborated from the start. In fact, post-Zoom coordination, they are probably at a disadvantage, since the process has likely alienated many other creative types who had their cherished ideas vetoed from the start. Slighted creative individuals are less likely to be part of an enthusiastic volunteer base going forward. The problem with creating a shared extended universe for fiction is the classic managerial problem called too many cooks. 2 authors is rare enough, but when you get to 3 or 4, forget about it. I have never seen a remotely coherent fictional work authored by more than 3 people. And this problem doesn't get better once you expand the question out laterally. The difficulty might appear strange enough because our problem seemed so simple from the outside. However, when we examine large extended universes in the corporate world, we are witnessing something of an illusion. Products like Warhammer or Star Wars maintain their coherency through a connection to a core set of outstanding copyrighted products that already generate millions of dollars in fans. These extended universes also have had the advantage of entering into the marketplace that was relatively underserved for its time. The fortified semi-monopoly of secure profits sheltered these corporate products from having to deal with real problems and real politics. And even this advantage was ultimately short-lived. Whereas initially, management was able to insulate its core product from the thousands of voices who would have otherwise ruined it for purposes of vanity, personal or political, now even the most conservative properties are succumbing to the corrosive nature of groupthink. Politics is the universal degenerative gravity that inhabits all collective endeavors. Money and profit defy it, but only for a time. So then, is the idea of an organically derived, shared extended universe completely off the table? Well, no, but here I think we have to discard the most obvious approaches. The portion of broth we want is too large for one cook to make, and employing multiple cooks will inevitably spoil it. But what other option could there be? Perhaps a solution that forces us to reconsider how we even think about authorship and cultural creation to begin with? Part 3. Engineering a Cultural Permaculture. The problem we encounter, consistently, every time we attempt to collect a product of this type, originates with our concept of property and authorship. This issue goes to the heart of what we call intellectual property, referred to through this letter by its corporate acronym, IP. Certainly, a library could be written on the flaws of intellectual property, but here we only need to be concerned with one faucet, namely the limitations it imposes on collective creative projects. Now, critiquing IP is difficult. It's hard to stand back and really get an understanding of the role it plays in our society, harder yet to imagine an alternative. Yet this approach to culture is relatively new. Our modern understanding of intellectual property attaches a text formally to an individual. Through the magic of incentives, both prestige and money, the concept of authorship incentivizes individuals to the task of making better and more noteworthy art. If one wants to be recognized as an artist who matters, they make texts and become identified as the author of said texts. By this creation, the artist's name is tied to his art, and he exerts a type of creative control on the product, either by influencing its further development, or at the very least, managing its interpretation. Authorship and IP is the prestige of the artist, and the individual incentives this system provides power the desire to create new and better things. And we need to admit, straight up, that this system works. It works very well with one author, sometimes less well with two, and almost never for more than three. But the system does work, and it keeps our idea economy going. But things were not always amenable to this approach, and in fact they may need to change again radically if we want something new to emerge. Like so many things that used to work in modernity but don't anymore, the problem with our IP system is that it presupposes the existence of a cultural infrastructure that has since been eroded and cannot be rebuilt by the system itself. The only recourse left to those who want something new is to return to the source of the error, patch it, and then move forward in a completely different direction. But given how long we've been enthralled to these notions, what would be an alternative? If we look back to pre-modernity, we see that culture and art, some elite variants notwithstanding, was not conceptualized in terms of strict authorship. People played their own music, crafted their own art, told their own stories, and used each of these texts in turn for the purposes required. Who authored this folktale or song? Very few people knew or cared. Of course, sometimes specific folk poets or artists put their names on things, but even here, it's amazing how many works simply don't have clear attribution. For instance, the most famous work of the late Renaissance music tradition, Greensleeves, doesn't have a clear author. We might think that the Brothers Grimm wrote Hansel and Gretel, that Robert Tannehill wrote Blooming Heather, and that Dick Dale wrote The Miserlou, but this belief is false in every case. These works came into being in their most primitive forms with essentially no author. Well, perhaps that's somewhat of an overstatement. These texts were the work of human hands, and therefore they did have authors. But if we tried to construct a bibliography in the modern IP sense, it would span hundreds, if not thousands, of names. Sometimes these names are grouped under the moniker of the last person who vivified the text, as in Grimm or Homer. Sometimes they are not. But for these authorless texts, one important thing remains. No person can or could exert political control on the text or corpus, not in person and not in the form of an estate speaking on behalf of the intellectual property. These works are functionally zero author. They are folk culture. The core issue with building a collective piece of culture, or folk culture, is that we are trying to use the tools of modernity to fix a problem that modernity rejects. We need organic culture, but the framework of modernity rejects the organic because it has no way of understanding organic texts outside a concept of property. As modern people, we look through the lens of our technological age. We view the problem of collective creation, or even the collective creation of folk culture, as a variation on the question of corporate production. Are many people working together to build an artistic text? That means there must be many authors. But this is the opposite conclusion we should draw. Authorship means property. Property means control. Property with more than two authors means disputed control. Disputed control means politics. and politics is the death of creativity and cultural life. No. Any shared, large-scale collectivized project should not strive to have many authors, or even one or two. It should strive for 0 authors. As many authors as Hansel and Gretel has. As many authors as Blooming Heather has. As many authors as Paul Bunyan has. 0 authors. You can't beat it. A complete absence of political control is the only way forward. No one dictates the artistic vision, no one's ego is at the center, no one sets the bounds for the mythology. The project evolves through the organic cycle of creation, mistake, and revision, iterated again and again, strength through evolution and not design. To return to our agricultural analogy, what we are doing here is shifting strategies. As opposed to finding the strongest pea plant to muscle out the weeds and start a new crop rotation cycle, we are simply clearing a space, mulching the soil, simulating an artificial ecological reset that would have occurred if the field had been left to follow, and then seeing what new non-weed plants might thrive. With enough time, water, and some corrective weeding, you will find the strong plants that can recreate the ecosystem that was lost to poor care to begin with. The trick remains to minimize oversight, not to make assumptions about what the environment can sustain, to establish boundaries, let many different varieties take root, encourage iteration, and let the process of regeneration be led by the strength of the plants themselves. What we want ultimately are great artists and great thematic visions. What we want eventually is another prize-winning crop. But before this occurs, we need an environment that can facilitate creativity across the board in an ecologically healthy direction. The common solution is folk culture. An environment that contains 0 author content that eventually facilitates a common creative language, a corpus of artistic works that may someday inspire a broader ecology of musicians, storytellers, poets, and designers. Ultimately, in the future, we hope that these creators may arrive at something approaching greatness. But this is not the state we are in currently. We aren't planting a cash crop. We are just building a cultural permaculture. Little improvements, creative safe spaces that encourage people to experiment with new stories, and more cultural content that can be freed from the stifling amount of creative and political control we have in our modern environment. But analogies aside, how could one actually do something like this? Part 4. On Board Games and Cultural Mutation. Alright, dear reader, since I have kept your attention until this point, let's see if we can't write out an outline for how such a 0-author collective cultural product could be produced. Impossible? Actually, no. Not if you apply good engineering principles. Principle number 1, start with what you know works. Principle number 2, keep it simple and stupid. Principle 3, don't reinvent the wheel. Starting with what we know, what does some modern, organic, 0-author cultural project even look like? Do we have anything that is close to this, that's modern, something specific, something workable? If we do, how closely can we observe this phenomenon? How does it work? And what do its outputs look like? In the era of social media, I'm sure people will have some good answers to these questions. There have been numerous Kickstarters that would fit this description, not to mention the somewhat less popular wiki collective fiction projects and interactive metafiction universes. But in line with our engineering principles, I want to keep things simple. In fact, let's leave behind the entire 21st century internet technology and start with simple pen and paper. Let's begin with my all-time favorite tabletop board game, hands down. No, not Dungeons & Dragons, rather a game called Exquisite Corpus. Now, if your friend group was anything like mine, highly verbal, autistic nerds, Exquisite Corpus is already a staple of your parties and get-togethers, typically employed at the tail end of parties when people still need a good laugh to close things out. The game, not much of a game in the classic sense, is more like an extended version of the children's activity Telephone. Still, despite its simplicity, I have never gone through a round that didn't have everyone laughing uproariously by the end. According to most sources, Exquisite Corpus was invented by the surrealist artist Salvador Dali in the 1920s to escape moments of creative lapse. The method of play is simple. We start with somewhere between 5 and 20 people who sit in a circular formation with a strip of blank paneled paper that contains a comic strip, The game starts with a caption round, where each individual writes a caption on the panel describing something, anything. After passing the papers to the next person in the circle, the round moves on to a draw round, often a little longer, where players have to illustrate the caption that was passed to them. In the next round, the second caption round, players are asked to provide captions describing the picture with no context. From this point, rounds alternate between captioning and drawing until everyone runs out of space to draw or caption, and with each new drawing or caption only being based on the previous caption or drawing in line. What is the eventual result of this process? No winner, certainly, but in any casual setting, Exquisite Corpse generates a series of absolutely insane comic strips as misunderstandings and misreadings pile on top of sloppily drawn pictures and hastily written captions. Just reading each of the paper comic strips out loud and passing the cartoons around is usually enough to get everyone laughing and in good cheer. Alright, so good group game, and definitely something you might try at your next party. Do Zoomers even have parties anymore? Is that still a thing in 2021? But actually, if we stand back and examine this process, the general forum can be used to much greater effect to drive creativity with a minimal amount of control. As alluded to in its origin, Exquisite Corpse is at its base a tool to explore the subconscious imagination. If taken seriously, over time, it can produce new texts completely disconnected from anything that the authors were thinking of before they started the project. As such, Exquisite Corpse can be viewed as an engine of sorts. Derivative ideas enter in one end, strange recombinations and mutations exit on the other. We can put the most cliché and trite trash into the input valve of this recombination process, even literally copyrighted IP, and regardless, a text will appear on the opposite end as a completely original work, but mutated beyond recognition. Furthermore, at a basic level, Exquisite Corpse captures the fundamental two-step nature of the human creative process, which generally iterates between two poles. First, a process of narrativizing a rendition we experience visually, and second, by rendering visually a narrative that we hear in stories. In short, humans tell stories about the things that they see, and they paint pictures based on the stories that they hear. If we link the two processes together, we have a microcosm of the process that has generated all folk culture across the ages. For those creative types out there, they will understand the experience. Narrative artists, or storytellers, always have their best ideas when they look to nature, or at least to something that they have witnessed in real life. That strange thing that needs an explanation or story for it to seem right. And on the opposite end, visual artists always have their greatest inspiration when their mind's eye is captured by a good story, asking the question, what if I were to see so-and-so in the place? What if I were to journey to that distant land I never saw? In short, folk culture, at its simplest, is simply the process of iterating narration and rendition. But instead of waiting for this process to take place organically over the course of decades, or even centuries, the engine observable in Exquisite Corpse, what I call the Exquisite Corpse cycle, forces it to operate over the course of 30 minutes in an incredibly narrow setting, accelerating it to ludicrous speed to create a kind of autonomous and spontaneous cultural mutation force, which makes the activity fun and hilarious. And being fun and hilarious is good for a game, but perhaps we could vary these parameters for something larger in scope. Returning to our original problem, what we are looking to do is to create a chain of linked texts, each of which can be used to inspire future, more original endeavors going on down the line. Okay, great, but how does this differentiate our project from culture in general? I mean, certainly culture naturally iterates, so what are we really learning from our example in Exquisite Corpse? Well, several things. The main objective is to accelerate the iterative process and drive it forward with a certain amount of rapidity. To this end, the presence of intellectual property is the main obstacle. We need to limit the amount of politics that occur over questions of how artistic work is used. And ultimately, if this first part weren't hard enough, we need to create a minimalistic review system to control the results and drive the process towards a certain predetermined goal. Both of these features is a natural element of the game Exquisite Corpse, but outside of the parameters of a game, we need to be much more specific. To put it bluntly, any type of folk culture generating system needs to have separate standards of intellectual property, legally and culturally. Anything that goes into the folk culture system needs to be shareable with a minimum amount of requirements for attribution. Authors can take credit for the things they produce, but they cannot exert creative control over future products based on the texts already created. Remember, this is a zero-author environment, and if things are proceeding as planned, while the individual texts might be traceable to their original authors, the general emergence of themes, aesthetics, or perhaps even settings and characters might be more vague. Furthermore, there has to be an open cultural understanding that iterating or copying is perfectly fine, with no exceptions. For instance, for those creative types out there, how many times have you come across a product that you loved except for that one little piece of it that you thought should have been left out or modified in some way? Well, in this case, you're in luck. Under a system of folk culture, any change you make, no matter how minor, is legitimate. Everyone can issue abridged forms of their favorite stories. Anyone can make their own audience member cut of their favorite films. Of course, we can't promise that anyone will read them, watch them, or promote your updated version, and there may need to be incentives to ensure that there is a level playing field between the original work and its derivative copies, with only cosmetic modifications. But still, the principle applies. Okay, people, if you've been reading this so far, you're probably waiting for the other shoe to drop. After all, I might be a crackpot, but I'm not naive. What I'm describing here is one requirement of our system. At this stage, I'm trying to remove barriers to iteration, but all I have really done is put a burden on the creators themselves. I have asked artists to give up creative control. And for what? So that their rivals can better use their products to beat them out in the long run? Furthermore, this is modernity we're talking about, right? I mean, in previous parts of history, people lived in close proximity, and folk culture was created, congealed, and became coherent because people had to tell the same stories and sing the same songs. It came out of necessity. Well, that necessity isn't here anymore, and unfortunately, since we don't have any other tools available, this absence will have to be compensated through crude management. To borrow the immortal words of Captain Jack Aubrey, men must be governed. And so too must projects. If we want people to write, they need to have goals, they need to have standards, they need to have incentives through finance or recognition, and this process will have to be managed and governed carefully. This is probably the hardest part of the project because it seems that we have just reintroduced the very problem we were trying to take out of the system to begin with, namely the issue of creative control. How will a management system work? Keep everyone in line and producing to the same ends, while not becoming corrupt and interfering with the creative process? Well, by setting up this management carefully, minimalistically, and with clear rules. The management system or organization, which we might call the board, should exist for the sole purpose of representing the interests of consumers who will eventually read, watch, play, or otherwise enjoy the texts created by the iterative process. For this purpose, the board acts only as a communication bridge and an overall steward, focusing consumer interests, making clarifications based on what's desired, and driving the fulfillment of this desire with financial incentives. This is not a small job. The board will need to take the temperature of what people want, configure it into digestible prompts, attach incentives, recognize winners, and then iterate the process forward, possibly shifting the medium to obtain the narrative rendition cycle seen in the Exquisite Corpus game, and doing this with as little impact as possible on the creative process. For this purpose, the board would have to be anonymous and unable to exert creative control outside rules clearly laid out at the start. The main requirement is that none of the board members can be linked, in name or in social media presence, to the collective production itself. Now, of course, this doesn't necessarily need to be airtight, but from the outside at least, the project cannot seem to be so-and-so's pet project. The board is the background, the people who ensure that the game is being played properly according to the rules, the referees. The people who submit content are the players. They are in the foreground. They are the authors, contributing to a collectivity that has no single visible author. From this point forward, we might imagine how a general process like this would go. We start a board with some initial investment capital. The board comprises a small set of interested individuals who agree to an initial plan, a board charter, and submit all of their decisions to a public record in a documentation database, like a wiki page. What proceeds in turn is the polling of a population to see what is the general interest, combining these interests with some existing IP into a core initial prompt document, and then soliciting content creators to submit work within a broad bound of that core prompt. Based on the prompt, the board receives texts in line with their requirements, establishes property for sharing purposes, and rewards high-quality submissions with incentives, prizes, and promotions. After each step, all submitted work is then archived in the database, which future artists are free to iterate on, and the board considers the next step, soliciting more media and content based on the popularity and quality of the work already received. Still too hand-wavy? Let's work out an example from the beginning to demonstrate proof of concept. We can call this prototype project the Exquisite Corpus project, based around our initial idea of building a shared, extended science fiction or fantasy universe that dissident people can use for their own creative writing and role-playing projects. Part 5. The Exquisite Corpus Project, a prototype. What follows from this point is a white paper concerning the use of the previously described method to produce a zero-author fictional extended universe. All details provided could be implemented by any medium-sized dissident community online or offline. Each step is outlined in detail with directions to the following steps included. Once more, this document is not designed to be an actual project proposal, but is rather a prototype, a first rough draft for people interested in doing something similar in the future. The outline of the Exquisite Corpus project. Step 0. Establish board, funding, and core charter. The first step is to establish a board with a basic understanding of the project objectives and constraints. The objectives need to be established ahead of time and with complete buy-in from the prospective members of the board. In our case, the mission statement can be written as follows. Create a Gothic science fiction universe with a core canon, a range of new short stories, art that illustrates the world, and an outline for prompts that might inspire further content creation while avoiding woke progressive political themes. Pretty vague, but necessarily so, because it isn't the board's job to define the universe, just to characterize the demand for a universe. Eventually, the core qualities will be formed by the creators themselves as we proceed through the steps outlined later. However, before anything else is accomplished, ground rules must be established for the board itself. An example board charter might look like this. 1. Board members are not creators or authors of the Exquisite Corpus project, just managers and quality control referees that represent the consumer's interest. 2. The board is responsible for publishing core prompt documents to solicit the creation of quality texts and publishing retroactive continuity documents that highlight the best submissions and discuss their integration into the project in a way that maintains their coherency and continuity with other submissions. 3. The identity of board members is closed to the public. Communication with creators outside of prompts is strictly prohibited. 4. Board members can submit work to the project as creators, but may not disclose their presence on the board as part of that process. However, board members cannot receive any prizes for submitted content or receive any compensation for their efforts. 5. Board members may use polling and market testing from an audience. All poll results are public, but the board is not required to act on any results they receive. 6. All board decisions are run on a supermajority. Board staff circulation is acceptable, but boards should never exceed more than 5 members. 7. All submissions to a prompt are public and held under a Creative Commons Share Attribution license. Starting from this foundation, the board opens a funding source, a bank account linked with a Subscribestar, Super Chat income, or Kickstarter, and a database wiki with the rules and charter listed in an About section. This gives us the basis for moving forward, including 1. Core seed money, 2. A centralized public database with space for dialogue, and 3. A core charter to control how the board proceeds forward. Step 1. Initial customer tests and art search. With the basic rules established, we need to start putting some flesh on the bones of the project. Once more, we want as much of this information on how to do this coming from outside the board. This could start with some basic brainstorming exercises, where a friendly audience is asked to contribute blurbs concerning what they would like to see in a new shared extended universe. All of these comments will be posted anonymously to some centralized database thread that can be archived. Really, I'm not anticipating any speed bumps here. If past experience is any test, people are very forthcoming with small pieces of feedback which don't require any focused effort or attention. For instance, if we were to float the idea of a new extended science fiction universe, we might expect to get the following comments. Universe should have a core political intrigue dimension. Universe should involve conflict between religious factions and contain religious themes. I would want a universe to contain conflict between different alien groups. Or, aliens are overused in extended universes. Please have this extended project be a strictly human-only space drama. Again, none of these concepts is particularly original. In fact, they aren't even really coherent. Obviously, choices will have to be made, but since incorporating any of these ideas into a prompt is optional, board members can always stop reading if they are pressed for time. The process works as long as there are enough core ideas to form a very basic guiding vision for the rest of the project. The next step, perhaps counterintuitively, is doing an inspirational vision search. After reading and understanding what a core audience wants, the board directs its attention to some image aggregator like Pinterest, or perhaps a less pornified version of deviant art. The purpose here will be to look for pictures that communicate the mood of what people want, the core artistic vision that could inspire people to tell good stories. With luck, none of these pictures will be easily identifiable as any well-known IP, even if they do come from a universe that is owned by a corporation, and the original source of the art will be cited explicitly in our database. Of course, we should note that none of these vision images will be considered part of our core output for the project, but at this point we don't really care. Generating our own art will come later. Right now, we are just looking for something visual that will inspire the first round of storytelling, and this can be easily done using other people's work. Step 2. Develop the core prompt document. Alright, so at this point we're ready to put together the first prompt document, one of the two major deliverables of the board. The prompt document needs to be, above all things, clear and succinct. Once more, the board isn't writing a universe outline, they're just prompting people to create their own universe. This means brevity is very important. In fact, I think there should be really only 4 sections: the initial blurb, the invitation to submit, the rules for submission, and the attendant documents to inspire and guide people to create successful submissions. Note to my YouTube audience, an example document is included on the Substack, but is left out to make the video less laborious. With this document outlined, there is a lot of text here, but to put things in perspective, it took me almost no time to write. An hour on the outside of things, and I know it's super derivative, but that's the point. I'm not trying to introduce creativity, I'm just trying to inspire it. What I have provided in the prompt document is a subtextual outline for 1,000 science fiction stories. I know Dune used this kind of idea, I know Warhammer used this kind of idea, it's a tried and true formula. The images used inside my document are all stock images that I got by searching Gothic science fiction art into Pinterest search bar and pulling up the first hits. The suggestions included at the end of the document are simply the classic short story prompts you'll get in a creative writing class. These things are all unoriginal. But as derivative as they are, these things do help encourage the creation of passable adventure stories. In fact, it's hard to find an adventure story that does not fit into this archetype, at least in the science fiction universe. We have created a fertile and empty ground, and can let the artists take their own flair and originality to this template to create something new. With this document in tow, an aspiring author should have no problem generating submissions. Perhaps this is presumptuous, but reading my own prompt now, I'm tempted to stop, pull up a different document, and start writing science fiction, instead of a dry outline of a collective fiction project that no one is actually going to implement. Does this make my prompt good? Probably not. In all likelihood, this initial attempt is weak tea, but I'm sure smarter people with more experience in creative writing could do a better job given a little more time and focus. Step 3. Determine winners and attempt to form an integrating narrative retcon. Assuming submissions are forthcoming, it now falls to the board to read and evaluate. This is probably self-explanatory, but there is going to be a large range and quality of short stories. The board is required to read submissions, select the elite, and pay out prize money. Here, board members are able to iterate on existing works to overcome core coherency problems with other selected works, if they are selected as winners. But from this new selection, a new retcon document is published to the database, where the board members determine a broad outline of the shared universe, incorporating what they have learned from the top short stories to be submitted. After prizes are awarded, the edited stories are elevated to a front page and become canon for our universe. Then, from this revised selection, the board begins work on a new retcon document to be published to the database. In this retcon document, board members determine a broad outline of the shared universe, this time incorporating the details they have learned from the top short stories. The retcon document should be short and provide a sort of dust jacket version of the universe that frames the core canon for anyone coming to the project for the first time. This is the blurb that future creators will read when trying to determine if they want to contribute. We can now take a step forward. We have a better understanding of the universe we are creating, of the universe that the artists have created themselves, and are ready to take the next step. Step 4. Purchase IP art for the next round of seed stories. Okay, so now for the fun part. We just accomplished the narrativizing portion of our project. Now we want to move on to the rendering step, and this means getting our own illustrations. This step will be significantly easier, because unlike the first part, where coordinating writers for money is like herding cats, the same is not true for illustrators, who are usually very willing to work for contract and who typically like plugging their imaginations into someone else's narrative project, at least in my own experience. In fact, there are entire dedicated websites where it is very easy to purchase original, high-quality art, especially if the work is targeted towards a science fiction or fantasy setting. Just take a budget and drop it on art. Make sure that this art illustrates both scenes from the top stories submitted and also depicts the broader universe based on the retcon document produced by the board in the previous stage. The requirements don't even need to be that specific. You might even be able to give the artist a story and just ask them to draw something they think might exist in the same universe. Again, I'm not expecting many problems here. Perhaps we can get a bulk rate on illustrations? And at this stage, we see that by combining the best and most evocative art with a narrative retcon document, we can iterate our original prompt into a second prompt, this time with more detail, more constraints, but also with a more exciting and developed universe to entice new creators to participate. At long last, the Exquisite Corpus project has its own content. People might not be just participating this time for the prize money, but because they genuinely like what they are seeing. A new round of stories and art should be easier to produce. From this point, the Exquisite Corpse loop is established. If the board wishes to go further into the development, it simply needs to repeat the process across steps 3 to 4, iterating between the narrative steps and the art-producing steps. Every step iterated creates a new prompt document and a new retcon document, which allows the universe to obtain its own character, its own feeling, and perhaps even its own fan base, independent of much political meddling. The process can continue until a set amount of texts are developed or left autonomously to grow with no outside funding or direct board management. Of course, fans can submit work to the database at any time, and this unsolicited content may be either ignored, left in a public archive, elevated to a news page to highlight potentially good material, or even incorporated into a core canon, which would place the work on some special pedestal page and include it for consideration during the illustration and prompt design stages. Active or not, every 6 months to a year, the managers of the database, most likely the board or the former board, should release some kind of core state-of-the-canon prompt, not so much to reward people for producing content, but rather to provide a new creative center and understanding of where the project is. Of course, branching, aka copying the universe as it exists and forming a mirror version with different continuity, and minor iterations on existing work would be allowed, but discouraged. Minor iterations on existing work should only be elevated from the archives in response to an overwhelming amount of fan support for these revisions. Branching the project into 2 universes should only be employed to confront irreconcilable creative differences within the community. With any luck, and with more submissions and more volunteer managers forthcoming, a certain amount of clout may slowly build behind the process. As this occurs, the original board may be able to retire and watch their project grow autonomously, and a new zero-author folk text has been born. Could this general outline work? Is it too crackpot? Maybe some of us can try it sometime. Best case scenario, we create the seeds of a new type of folk culture. Worst case, we pay for an interesting set of creative stories, new art, and the most epic game of Exquisite Corpse ever played. Sounds fun to me.